Just to alert our sensitive viewers, this episode may contain a bit of coarse language.
Hello, everyone. My name is Christy Blumendahl.
And my name is Rocco Catroni, and we are the Disability Tangent Podcast.
Each episode, we talk about current issues affecting communities while supporting people with disabilities.
Through research, community connections, and resource sharing, we hope to invite everybody to challenge their perceptions of people with disabilities and promote a more inclusive world.
Defined by what the people actually want and not what others think they want.
Come join us on this journey.
All right, let's do this thing.
No. All right, welcome everyone. Today we are talking about ageism and disability.
Ageism.
Give me a definition, Rocco. What is your definition of ageism?
I feel like anything that has an ism in there, the first half of it is what people think of as quote unquote right. So if there's an ageism piece, it's that how does age impact the perception of anything, really? Older folks having ageism saying, back in my day it's this. Younger folks having the idea that today this is a different context, so here, then we hear things like, oh, okay, boomer, or okay, snowflake. Yeah. Yeah, so it's the idea that age alone holds a correct weight in life and lived experience that might invalidate other ages. I know. That's what comes to mind with that.
Yeah, I think that does make sense. I liked your expression of anytime there's an ism and then what comes before it also. That's a good way to think about it. Because there's so many isms out there, so that's an apt recommendation to look at it that way. Yes, I agree. I think there's definitely this way of thinking there's a right way. There's some sort of a expression that is correct. And then there's this otherness about an other expression. I think it falls a lot of times also into this, you can't do this, or you aren't in this club. I find it interesting because I have friends that are in all sorts of age groups. It's not that this doesn't affect me. It definitely does. Before we started recording, we were talking about stuff, and then we were like, oh crap, are we being ageist? Because we have a different outlook and like we're older than some of the people that we may or may not have been describing. And it's not that it doesn't affect me, but I think it's a little bit different because I have friends that are nearly 70 and then I have friends that are 20 something that are like the age of my daughter. And I don't always look at them as though they are terribly different from me. But then I guess there are also sometimes things that I'm like, oh my gosh, like, you're 11. Stop acting like you know everything. Yeah.
But I feel that because there's definitely a context and a experience you get as you get older, especially as you live past through and in between different ages of like humanity, things that are popular, major events, things that shape you in different ways depending on your age. So for folks in my general age category, September 11th hit very differently than folks who are older or folks who are newly born. And you can see like how those major events hit people. There's, for my age group, my wife and I talk about this a lot of, we live really close to O'Hare Airport. And whenever we see a plane going a slightly different way, it immediately triggers this fear of, uh-oh, it's happening again. And even though it's 23 years past that point now, it still holds a whole different context. But then when I'm talking with folks who are adults during that time, it holds a slightly different association with that. And I'm going to be super curious what's going to happen, especially with things like COVID, like when we're all adults and people who were raising or not raising children or in new relationships or starting new jobs or starting and transitioning in and out of school, you know, what types of experiences do people have? Everybody was experiencing the same thing just from different vantage points. And I think that's going to create some tension in the future because it's, well, at least you didn't have to figure out how to pay the bills. And it's, yeah, but my whole social development was completely stunted because I never contacted anybody. So I imagine that there's going to be an ageism piece to that in the next, I don't know, 15 to 20 years, looking back on these times.
Yeah, I definitely can see that. It's interesting. I was talking with someone recently and I said something about the space shuttle exploding. And they were like
All the
yeah,
Challenger
they were like
yeah.
the space shuttle exploded and I was like, "Oh yes, we were watching it on live television in the library at school. Like they had us all there because there was a civilian and she was a teacher and it was a whole thing. So they packed all of the students into the library and we were watching it like on live TV and all of a sudden kaboom, and it was like
Yeah.
here we were and she was like, what happened? And I'm like, they quickly turned it off and ushered us all back to our classrooms. And then I think for the younger students it was, oh, we're just going to pretend that didn't happen and go about our day. Maybe some of the older students had a little bit of contacting some sort of discussion around it. We're like, oh my gosh, that was shocking, how do y'all feel? But for most of us it was very much like this strange event where like kaboom, oh my god, that was frightening. And then a little bit of tempered panic from our teachers, and then we tried to go back. And then we tried to go back to our day, and so it was this very odd. Here's how we handle a life-altering event, right? We freak out quietly, shove it under the rug, and then go to math class. And I think that affected me in ways that I probably never paid attention to. But then when I was talking to this other person who didn't experience that, they were like, what? Why? Like, how? What? Who would do that? And it was just a really interesting thing to recognize that not only did they not experience that, but the things that they did experience, like later on in life, that did happen and that they did watch unfold were addressed in such a different way because we had come so much further in like mental health care and reducing trauma and trauma-informed care that they had a completely different experience of like, how do we connect with things? And so in some ways, I feel like this whole difference of connecting with things, sometimes as an older person, you get in the mindset of that's not how I experienced it, or yeah, we didn't do that back then. And you don't stop to think about how it might be better or more appropriate the way that people are dealing with things now. And just because you were strong or stubborn or went through it in this like tough way doesn't necessarily mean that was the best way to do it.
Yeah, just because it worked doesn't mean it was right.
Yes, and so when you're like, oh, okay, snowflake or whatever, like that's meant as an insult to be like, oh, you can't handle tough stuff. But maybe handling tough stuff in this very, I don't know, distant kind of like non-handling way wasn't an appropriate way to handle it in the first place. That was a big tangent.
No, I don't think that was a tangent, though, because that really reminds me of how within societies, and I think many societies have this kind of age hierarchy, but it's not just the hierarchy of, oh, respect your elders, this person knows more, but there's different expectations at different ages, right? As if there's some magic thing inside your body that like, oh, you're 7 years old, you should be able to sit for 7 hours and listen to a lecture at school for 5 days a week, or you're 15, you're supposed to know this thing, or you're 21, you're supposed to be an adult now, and you're 30, and it's, wow, you should have this like level of maturity. But there's less of a focus on how to actually get to that point, and I think the expectation of age and the repertoires that we're supposed to have reign true, but then there's no culpability on the culture for actually like teaching those things. So back in my day, we did this. Cool. You lived in a time with different policies. You lived in a time with different expectations, and today it's a little bit different. But then I also feel like, see, now I feel like the old person. I feel like some kids or younger folks today, or people who are younger than me, are approaching these things a little bit differently because now they had access to a bunch of different types of information, the advent of the internet, and that being ingrained into what their lives were. So then there's more examples of what each age is, but then it's also portrayed at different ways. It's not, you're not hearing it from community members. You're not trusting community members because now you could say, oh, are you sure that's right? And you take out your phone and you answer the question. So there's this like level of trust and expectation that changes over time that I think has to be factored in when there are these like discourses and discrepancies. And I think the way you describe that kind of happens like that, right? Because you're coming from a lived experience standpoint of this is how this was handled, and hindsight's 2020. You can always look back and say that's ridiculous. So yeah, now you think that's ridiculous because now we know quote unquote better, or we know more information about the lasting effects of that type of approach. But in that moment, that's the information that you had, and that worked, and people survived, and people moved on, and it was a workability thing at the time. So I don't know, and I think people don't give enough credit to context in those situations and operate on their own and applying what they know to a situation, thinking that's right.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's something to be said about that too, right? This sense of self-compassion, or maybe generational compassion, that we need to express, to be like, oh, you did the best you could with what you had, and I did the best I could with what I had, and now this generation is doing the best that they can with what they have. And so yes, there are these maybe basic structures that we can put in place and say, yeah, this is a milestone, maybe you should be hitting it. This is maybe in general a thing that if you're not seeing your toddler connect with X, like maybe that's a thing to consider or talk about at least. And if your 11-year-old is not hitting this and all of their peers are hitting this, like maybe that's a discussion. But it doesn't necessarily mean that this is how you need to be at age whatever, and that's how I was at that age, and so you also need to be that way at that age. No, the evolution of many things is happening, and we have to understand that society is different. They're different than I was, and that's maybe not a bad thing. And understand that, yeah, we can be compassionate across all of that.
And there's validity to that connection and being able to talk between age groups and generations. We see that in research when, let's say, one generation speaks to two generations up and shares those ideas. What does that context look like? How do those things change? And there's benefits for both parties involved. It's not just the younger generation 100% learning from the older, but it's also the younger generation helping the older mediate what's currently happening and saying, maybe the way you're thinking is not necessarily wrong, but there's a different topography or a different way to do this thing now. And you can still get at it. You still get the thing that you want. It might just look a little bit different. And I think that's also something that's underestimated a lot, especially as more and more people aren't living with relatives or living in those tighter communities. Although, honestly, maybe the housing market at this time might be making that a thing again. Maybe there's some, I hate to say that, and maybe there's some positive aspects of the way that policies and things are having people needing to come together to be able to create these communities with blood family or chosen family. And maybe that'll change over time. But so that was a little bit of a tangent.
I know. It was good though. What I think before we started recording, we were saying it's called the disability tangent. What did you come here expecting? Not tangents? No. No, but let's
in a narrative tone.
Move on to the relationship between ageism and disability, because there are a lot of parallels and there's a lot of connection. And yeah, if we tie this in to, ageism, there's a lot that overlaps.
Christy, when you think about that, how do you think age, either the physical change over time or the perception of it, how does that relate to disability for you? Or like what pops up when you see that kind of thing?
Yeah, lots, frankly. I think that there's a number of different things. I feel like in my life, especially, there's been a lot of different ways that it shows up. I think one is that there's this discussion of milestones and markers that you should hit. And there's definitely sometimes a misunderstanding of things like that in the discussion of disability. And I think that it can be a really damaging way to connect with children, especially, and adolescents, to be like, oh, you're not the same as your peers, and to be making a constant comparison. And I think that there's also a lot of misunderstanding around things like that. So, for instance, in recent years, they're finding that there wasn't a lot of study done around autistic girls, right? It was a lot of autistic boys that we were looking at, and not to be binary, but the work that they were doing was very binary. So that's why I'm being binary about gender right now. And so there tended to be these differences that existed, whether I guess we don't fully know why at this point even, but like maybe hormonally, maybe who knows, but it seems that there were these things that you could point to and say, oh, autism means that these markers are not being met, and that was not the same for females as it was for males. And so there were a lot of things, like with me, with my daughter, where like we would fly ahead in particular areas and fall very behind in others. And that was seen as a failing of our own, right? Like we weren't trying hard enough in one area, we were excelling in another. So we were really smart, but why were we not doing good here? And so it wasn't attributed to any sort of disability because we didn't meet the criteria, right? There was this thing about our mile markers for our age group that we weren't connecting with. And so I think there are challenges there. I think then move forward, and in my adolescence, I didn't make a lot of sense to people because I seemed very adult in some ways. And then I had some very like childish things like temper tantrums. I should be over that. I shouldn't behave in that way. That's childish. And so there were things that just didn't line up. And rather than attribute that, again, to mental illness, to disease, to things that had gone wrong inside my brain because of the way that I developed, because of trauma that was happening in my life, that was seen as some sort of moral failing or some sort of thing that was in me. And it wasn't connected in ways. And I think that a lot of that had to do with these ageist thoughts, right? It was just tied to a different thing because of these. Yeah. And now as I am getting older, and now having these situations with my other disabilities, physical disabilities, mobility challenges, my movement disorder, shaking, all of these different things, these are all seen as older people problems, right? So I am in my late 30s, early 40s, and I'm starting to have a shake like I have Parkinson's. I don't have Parkinson's. I have essential tremor. They are different, but have many similar symptoms. And so I'm starting to shake. I'm tripping over my own feet. I'm having all of these different challenges that people then attribute to age-related disorder. And so I get treated in these ways where people will say, oh, you're too young. You're not in pain. Oh, you don't feel that way. You're too young to feel that way. And they minimize what I'm going through and minimize my experience because they say, oh, you're too young. You're too young. You're too young. No, I'm clearly am not too young to be suffering some sort of pain or have some sort of tremor or be tripping over my feet and need a walker or a cane. And there are actually, it's not just the way that I feel that's bothered by that. There are things that happen out in the world. Like I'm discriminated against more perhaps than some other people. When I get on the bus with my cane, people won't get up and give me a seat because they look at me and they think Kane plus pretty young thing don't equal stand up and give her a space. She's not a person who needs a seat. She can hold on. What's her problem? That's the thing that I get bothered by a lot of times, is that, right, the idea that I need assistance and I'm also a young person doesn't seem to compute for people in this ambulatory space. I think if I am in my wheelchair, that's different, because then they just assume my legs don't work and then it's fine, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's this like confirmation bias or various halo effects that happen when you see one aspect about someone and then you apply it to all aspects about that person. They see maybe like physicality, like you look younger, and it's that doesn't match with Kane, or that doesn't match with disability,
right?
Non-ambulatory or reduced ambulatory. And I think it's, what are those things that is curious to me is, how are we teaching people to see the things in the environment, and what are we supposed to do in response to that, right? So you see someone with a cane, that should immediately trigger, oh wait, maybe this person has difficulty standing up because they literally need an external device to do this. Perhaps they should sit in the chair. Whether or not that person is 5 or 15, 55, 95, those are the things that should be prompting that kind of behavior. Sorry, I'm talking about this as a behavior analyst. Those are the kinds of things that should be like in your head, oh, this is how I should be responding in those cases. But it seems that age tends to win out in those cases, where if it's between you look younger but you have a cane, I'm just going to go with the look younger thing, so you probably are fine to stand up. Or vice versa, you look older but you are responding maybe developmentally in a particular way, like maybe you look like physically you're 32 but developmentally you're 7. I'm going to go with the age thing first, and you should act your age, right? And it seems like age has the heavier, more dense, more important function to that, that's how people view others. And I wonder if that's, I don't know what the reason behind that is. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think it's so weird, because it's like you choose one and then you run with it.
Yeah.
So my friend and colleague Meg and I are getting ready to speak at a conference about stigma and disability and sex, basically, and talk about how there's a lot of this stuff where caregivers might gatekeep the expression of your sexuality, your either identity or actually some of that pleasure seeking. And I think, so you choose one, right? You're like, oh no, you seem young and unable to grasp a concept that for me, I don't want you to necessarily grasp. And so even though you are 35 years old, I'm going to stop you from having this sexual experience. And that's also a strange thing, right? Where, oh no, I've chosen for you that this is the place where you are going to be placed in the age category, and now you don't get to behave in this other age category, even though that is the legal age that you are. And so I think, yeah, there's this determination, and it's often made externally, right? It's not like I am deciding how I am and how I feel and who I am representing myself as, right? And so it's a very odd thing to have someone else determine for you how they think that you get to be in the world. And that's the thing that I think is so strange about all of this, is that, right, those two things are not congruent in their mind, so they choose one, and then they apply it to all of your behaviors and how you get to show up in the world, which is nonsense, quite frankly. No, I choose how I show up in the world. I tell you how I'm showing up in the world. If I'm showing up with a walker, that's how much I have to give in the world today. If I'm showing up in my tracksuit and I'm running, not that I wear a tracksuit ever, but and I'm running running down the street, then that's what I have to give today. You know, there's a man that shows up at the track, like just to the side of my building and every day, and I am well aware of him, and I know that even though he looks like he could potentially be poked with a pencil and all of his bones would shatter and he would fall apart, he goes round and round. That he is so emaciated that I question whether I should bring him a sandwich sometimes, but he is so old and so emaciated, but he just goes round and round that track every day. And I'm like, this man is so strong. Like, you would not look at him and be like, this is a healthy, strong person. I'm sure that people misjudge all of the time that this old man is just an old, frail man. No, he is not. There is some strength to this man. But the only reason I know that is because I see him running laps around the track every day, and I understand that he definitely has stamina and strength that I could never ever have. But I still have to catch myself and be like, oh gosh, Chrissy, every time you look at him, that first thought is, I have placed a level of ability or disability upon him because of the way that he looks. And the age that I assume connects with that. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, and I think we all do that to a degree, right? I feel like, to be sciencey for a moment, you know, humans and creatures are built like that, to discriminate between things in the environment. When I say discriminate, I mean saying that this thing is different than this thing. I think culture then comes in and gives importance to what that difference actually means. Yep. You look this way, I look this way, we are different people. And then we can say and teach that difference is great and there's things that we can learn, or the culture can teach that difference is bad and wrong, and insert your ism here. And when we have those moments where we see that we are engaging in that, even taking those small pauses to really analyze, oh, that was weird, where did that come from, right?
Yep. Hello, and welcome to the Disability Tangent podcast, where we explore the diverse experiences and voices within the disability community. Our platform is more than just a podcast. It's a beacon of empowerment, education, and inclusivity.
We're reaching out to potential sponsors who believe in the power of storytelling to create positive change. By sponsoring the Disability Tangent podcast, you're not just supporting a show, you're investing in a movement that aims to break down barriers and amplify the voices of those often marginalized in mainstream media.
Your sponsorship not only helps us continue to produce high-quality, impactful content, but also demonstrates your commitment to inclusivity and diversity. Together, we can create a more inclusive world where everyone's story is heard and valued.
Join us in this important mission. Partner with the Disability Tangent podcast and be a part of this change.
To share about my own personal story with that, I think there's a lot of self-stigma that I've gone through with that, because the thing, or at least the theory behind the thing of that disabled me in many ways, was going through cancer when I was 6 months old, had a complete nephrectomy, so my left kidney was removed. It was from Wilms tumor, which back in the day was very, very unlikely for someone to survive because they didn't have the type of technology. There were new studies coming out. We were part of that rotation. It was great that we were in the right group, but it was something that I don't directly remember, but there are things that affected me. So like stainless steel, the smell of those cavi wipes. Even today, and I worked in a hospital, and the smell of the cavi wipes would just trigger something deep. But not having experienced that thing, but having so many people tell you what your disability identity was, oh, you're the sick kid because of X. You've survived so much. You've overcome so much. And there's all of this inspiration porn thought process behind that, right? And inspiration porn, Stella Young, I think we've talked about her before. She has a really good TED Talk about that. And trying to navigate that and mediate that was very difficult, because the parts that I do remember are all the post things. Going to the doctor frequently, having a shot immune system, because apparently you can't pump a tiny little body full of chemo and not have effects like developmental delays, cognitive delays, but also just I got sick at the drop of a hat. Some people would get a cold and they'd be out for a day or two and they felt bad. I would get a cold, I'd be out for a week and a half and I couldn't function and I was throwing up everywhere from like a simple thing. And although that's changed over time, sometimes when I would try to identify as having that type of disability and identifying as a sick kid and cancer survivor and these developmental delays, it very much was, oh, but you're responding so well in school and you're so young. That's not a thing. You have overcome that. And what people then don't see are all the things that led up to that moment that I'm meeting that person of, we found workarounds because I had a supportive environment. Not everybody does. Yep. And there's obviously other privileges that go into that, just my skin color, where we were financially at some points and other points. But that kind of combination between the age of when the disability happened, not necessarily how age affected it then, but when that happened to me was before my memory, and that was a really hard thing to reconcile over my lifetime, and pushing against it sometimes and coming back to it, but then always feeling like I was a poser. I wasn't actually disabled because I couldn't remember any of those things or pull any of those lived experiences. I just saw the after effects of things. So that's where age for me came in. And now that I'm older, and this year will be almost 31 years cancer free, so that's cool.
Yay.
Yeah, hey, look at that. But even that, I feel like there's like a flippancy to it, because I don't remember. I'm glad I'm here and this thing happened. Thanks, cancer, for making some things harder. I wish I could remember at least a little bit of it. Now that we're in this older age, it's that age has become, now you're so far removed from this, and time heals all. And it's, maybe it didn't really heal in this case, you just find different avenues and different working things to do. So now I had someone in a previous place, and I won't even go too far into it because it was a disparaging comment, but it was coming from a good intention. And they would say, you're older now and you've overcome so much, it's almost like it never happened, and you are literally indistinguishable from other people in the workplace right now. And I never really knew how to work with that. And I think some of it was tied to an age component because they also didn't see me during those times. It was hard to explain how to work through that, and you just go like, haha, yeah, and then you move on to the next thing. But so kind of the take that back, because I think I started going down a little rabbit hole. The age piece for me was more, when did things occur? And now that distance is continuously growing, it becomes less heavy, dense, salient, whatever word you want to use. But at the same time now, I am getting older, and there is an inextricable link between age and disability. You live long enough, your body's going to start responding in different ways. I had knee surgery 7 years ago, and your body's not made to be poked and be okay. And now I'm dealing with those other physical things where it's, okay, cool, I've left this disability identity from when I was younger, but now I'm slowly moving into an age disability of things are a little bit slower. I don't recover as quickly from sickness or from having 3 glasses of wine or from these other pieces. So I don't know. I know, Christy, you and I have talked a lot about that too, that kind of inextricable link where people stigmatize that age component, but eventually you're going to get there. What are some thoughts you have around that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I've had a few thoughts. So I at one point wrote a little bit of an article about it because my parents used to dress up as old people when they were a bit younger and have these age-related parties. So like when someone would turn 40, they would dress up like old people, put on white wigs and get walkers and stuff from the thrift store and act as though they were old ladies or old men, and they thought it was funny. And it occurred to me that a lot of my internalized ableism I think is because of how my parents portrayed that, and where they were using mobility aids as a joke. And I think that affected me in ways I didn't really realize until I saw people my own age doing that same thing. And to their credit, there's nothing else to do in Northwest Iowa, literally. You can drink yourself stupid, you can go to church, or you can have stupid theme parties.
Those are the avenues.
Or you can look at corn while it grows. That's the other thing. Not edible corn. Just John Oliver this past week talked about corn, if you need to know. But anyway, yes, the whole thing about dressing up, though, it's just so shocking to me, because now most of those people, this is a really horrible thing to say, most of those people are not alive. Many of those people who were having those parties are not alive. And a lot of them, like my mom died at 67, and she had early onset Alzheimer's. So she was for many years struggling before that. I think of our neighbor who had MS and then had a brain hemorrhage, very shockingly, recently. And I think of the many men and women who had cancer that had these long, not great, and and I feel like there's all these things where they thought it was so funny when they were younger, and it really wasn't funny at all, because 20 years later, many of them were going through the challenges of actually being in the situation where they needed these mobility aids themselves, and where they were in these challenging places. And a lot of them did not live long. And I feel like to make fun of that, maybe it helped in some way for them to deal with their mortality, but I have a feeling that it really didn't. I have a feeling that it just created more ableist thinking. And it did for me. It did for me create more ableist thinking, and it made me think poorly of myself when I needed to stop working, when I needed to start using a cane, a walking stick, when I needed to utilize a walker, when people look at me in public, when I need to be in a wheelchair or on a scooter or whatever, and people look at me odd, it makes me feel some kind of way. And I think that's directly related to how that was addressed. That idea of, oh, it's funny to be old and decrepit. And I feel like that was harmful in so many ways. And I wish that there was a way to separate out age and disability, but there's not, because that's where we end up. We end up older, and when you end up older, you end up with more challenges, mobility-wise, health-wise. It just tends to happen, right? We're not meant to live forever. Queen song, I'm just having a Highlander moment in my mind. I'm not going to sing it for you, but oh my God, they're making a new Highlander. I'm so excited.
Maybe they're canon.
Anyway, sorry, that was a tangent. Highlander moment, and then excitement about a new Highlander. Sorry, that was very distracting. I don't know why. I just was like, who wants to live forever? And I couldn't get out of it. I just got trapped in the loop. I was just there. Can't help it. Just
it's a good loop.
Sword fights and gorgeous long locks, and it just had a good
aesthetic.
Okay, I'm coming back to it. I am. Where was I? The inevitability of disability. That's where I was.
Yeah, so how do we, we can't necessarily take age out of disability, or I guess disability.
That's what I was going to say. Maybe we could take age out of disability, but we can't take disability out of age. Maybe we could take one... Wait, did I say that the way I meant to say it? I think so. Yes, like maybe we can take age out of disability, but not take disability out of age. So the understanding being, at some point, disability is probably coming for us all. Like, the longer you live, the more likely you are to need the access for disability. However, that doesn't need to flip the reverse. We don't need to assume that people who are younger don't have disability, and we don't have to educate in ways and connect in ways and communicate in ways that make it seem as though it is odd or inappropriate or somehow unacceptable for disability to be present from birth forward, because it's not. It's normal. It's absolutely normal. Disability is a normal expression of human genetics. I don't know what I'm trying to say.
The human condition.
Yes,
Yeah.
it just is. It's a normal expression. And so I think we need to understand both, that we will all likely be disabled. It's normal. Also, kudos to you if you are one of those people who gets to be old before the disability enters your sphere of experience.
And that, or if you do have things that impair you in certain ways, you're either in a community that accepts you enough that you can enjoy that time and not have the community force that identity on you, I think is the other thing that pops up. Because there's times where it's, oh, Mom, you can't do that anymore because of X. Now, legitimately, there might be some things like, listen, if you have dizzy spells or you have a hard time balancing, please do not stand on the third step on the ladder, standing on top of the counter, trying to grab cups from the top shelf. Maybe don't do that, right? From a purely safety standpoint, but I think there's this like infantilizing, like making people feel younger, and this like elder baby talk that happens, and this expectation that when the person stops being productive, it's almost like they're a child again, and people have to take care of them as if they are a child. And that's an issue though too, and that kind of reminds me of some of the articles that you and I have been sharing recently. And for our listeners out there, Christy and I share a lot of articles. There's unfortunately many instances of disability stigma out there, but just as a quick aside, not a sponsor, but Disability Scoop is a really good place to find this information, and we'll put that in the show notes as well. But with some of these topics, Christy, like what can people do about those things? If there's an identity that's forced on someone because they're aging or because of their age, maybe they're younger, so it's, oh, you don't quite understand this thing. It's, well, I also have an intersectionality of trauma as well, so maybe I do know a little bit more than you think I do about some of these situations. Is there something we can do, or like, what are some of those thoughts that pop up on next steps for addressing things?
I think one thing definitely is to honor people's lived experience and to not try to place your experience over or above anyone else's experience. I think it's really easy to think in terms of hierarchy or I know better, but you don't always. And I think number one is always to listen. Just listen. And then not assume that your experience is in some way better. So I think if someone says what they want or what they need, don't be like, no, you need this. Unless they're absolutely being ridiculous. Like, I need to eat cotton candy for every meal all the time and you can't make me do anything different. That might be problematic. But it might not be problematic. That's the other thing, right? My mother, toward the end, when she was having trouble getting enough nutrition, only wanted to eat Lucky Charms breakfast cereal. And so guess what she ate? Lucky Charms breakfast cereal. Morning, noon, and night. Like, it was fortified with minerals and vitamins. It was fine. It was something that she was eating that was helping to sustain her life. So sometimes it's fine to do those things. Other times, maybe you need to encourage some other changes. But most of the time, let people choose their own path. Don't tell them what path they should be on. I think that's one of the things. So if I say, no, I do have pain. Yes, I do have trauma history. Oh, I do know what I'm talking about. Maybe just believe me. Like, that's a great start. Let's believe disabled people.
Yeah, like validation first. They're telling me that you are telling me that something is happening, and although you as the outsider might not be able to see, feel, experience, or agree with those things, doesn't mean that's not necessarily true. That's that person's truth in that moment there. How do you work through those things? But that information should be taken seriously, not as I'm the expert, so I know.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I think another thing is definitely to work on all of the isms, right? We said there's a lot of isms, and I think that also talked about, you mentioned, oh, maybe your culture is emphasizing this particular thing rather than being this supportive space. And I think that's one thing that really comes to light in a lot of this discussion. And we had talked about, I had sent you an article earlier this week, I think from Axios. I don't remember exactly, but
it was from Axios.
And it had talked about, it was super ageist. It basically talked about how the next generation is aging, and it's going to be a huge problem because so many people are going to leave the workforce, and then also people are going to have to leave the workforce to care for those people. And it was super terrible because it was basically like America's going to have such a terrible situation on its hands because the economy is going to go to shit because people are going to take care of their loved ones who are declining. And
yeah, because we increase social capital, we lose out on financial capital.
Yes, I was so devastated by it. It basically said, when you read between the lines, it basically said that you have absolutely no value as a person unless you are actively in the workforce. There's no purpose to you whatsoever if you are a person who needs care or a person caring for a person who needs care. Screw that. You are better off dead. We are better off without you. I don't think it realized that it was saying that, which is the really crazy thing about it. I don't think that the person writing the article noticed in any way, form, or manner that they were being ageist, ableist assholes.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I think to that degree, though, there's probably a certain level of truth to that in the way that the expectations in society is set up, where if we're continuing, maybe something that could have saved that article is at the end, if we're continuing on the path of expectations and work the way that we are, also this other thing with an aging population is occurring, these two things are not going to mix together. And that's not going to mix well. So something has to change. But I think where we took issue with the article is I think the thing that had to change was the aging piece of it. And
right, it was like, don't age.
Maybe works need to be
Yeah,
more
it wasn't like
yeah.
It wasn't like, oh, we shouldn't be such a hyper-capitalist consumerist society that doesn't allow for us to take care of our elders. No, it was basically like what needs to change is aging. Disability.
Yeah. How do we limit aging?
How do we stop
basically,
that?
They were saying, how do we live forever? Or if you're not productive anymore, how do we keep people productive until the very short period before they are no longer
like
here?
Maybe we could knit sweaters? I don't know. I can't knit sweaters. I only have one capable hand. That's questionable. So it can't eat soup.
I can't imagine that's going to get any better as I get older. Yeah, so I think I like those pieces, though. It seems like that maybe the base value, maybe, and maybe some of the things that we teach along with that is validating people's, like you said, experiences, and that those are important things, because I think that might span, at least across a lot of the isms in general, to at the very least understand. I feel like that goes one more step than awareness. I feel like there's that acceptance piece, and we see that a lot with like autism awareness versus autism acceptance. And I wonder if it's that acceptance component of I value that I value and understand that your experience had led you to this point. I can disagree with you, but teaching people that you can see the pattern that got that person to that point,
Yeah.
right? And not pass open judgment on that. I think there's always going to be a little bit of something where people are like, I wouldn't do that. And it's like, yeah, but you weren't in this situation, or this isn't your life. But to get people to that point of acceptance and understanding can be very strong. And I wonder if the doing part then comes secondary to that. Because if you're able to accept and understand people, and then voting comes along, or policy comes along, or a person comes along that challenges your previous conceptions, if you have that repertoire, if you have that ability to identify, accept, understand, you might make decisions a little bit differently than, oh, this person's trying to take resources from me. It's, oh, this is interesting. This person lived a different life. They're trying to gain resources to create a more equitable situation. Maybe this isn't something that I'm fighting and pushing back and voting against on.
Yeah. I find that interesting too, because I feel like, I'm not going to say my family has become more liberal, but one person in particular in my family that I look at, who I can say, like, when I divorced an abusive husband, their stance on divorce shifted, right? When my cousin came out as gay and passed because of AIDS, I don't know why I'm saying passed. I feel like I have to somehow cushion it, but usually I don't say that because I find it an odd word. Like, he died, and he died because of AIDS, and like that shifted them into this new space. When I became disabled, it shifted them into this new space. When my mom had to give up all of her resources in order to stay in a facility that would help her for memory care, it shifted them into this space. And I think it makes sense that, like, understanding these things, not just from here's a policy, but understanding it from here's a personal connection, has shifted their view of politics, because it's no longer this idea out here somewhere. It's people that you see in your life. And I think that makes such a big difference. And if you can divide yourself from the people in your life, that's a whole other thing, right? That's a level of narcissism that maybe is not something we want to talk about, because then I'll have only tangents all the time. But and maybe some crazy eyes. But I feel like, yeah, that's a different thing. But if you really want to hear people, and you're really going to have a legitimate, caring conversation with them and value what they say, like, it changes you to discuss these things, because it's changed their lives, their experience. Things are different. And I think when you sit with it and are honest about it, rather than putting your own judgments upon everything that they say, that's the other thing, right? Listening with care and consideration rather than listening with judgment. Because what you'll want to do is say sometimes, I wouldn't. But you don't know that you wouldn't, right? That's the thing that I try to get across to people. Like, you don't know that you would act any differently if the situation were the same, because your situation hasn't been the same. All things being equal, you might do exactly the same thing. You might do a worse thing. You might do an absolutely bonkers kind of thing. You don't know, because you haven't been in that same situation. So I think, like, the idea, this voice in your head that comes up and says, I wouldn't, that's you trying not to absorb something that's challenging you, right? That's challenging your preconditions. And I would voice away for a minute and just absorb what the other person is offering you.
Yeah, so it's that intentional contact, and I think that's such an important piece, and from the research side of things, we see that. And I know we've talked about this in other episodes about Alport's contact theory, where, like, to a certain extent it worked in some areas of, like, having different examples and seeing people experience things is one aspect of that. But then we see research like now moving forward, and then it's that intentional contact of what do you do with that information. So let's just say exactly what you said. Here is this experience that someone has. What do I do with that now? How do I contact that in a way that's accepting and not yes, but? We want to go, what if they're right? Not yes, but this also thing. This other thing.
This also thing. This also thing.
Whoops. Error 404. Comprehension not found. It was a really nerdy joke. Yes, I agree with that, and I think that fostering peace happens. We talked about this in our class recently. There's a couple classes we're teaching around like diversity, equity, inclusion, disability. One of the things that pops up for us in this class often is one engaging in that discourse in a way that, or arguing with someone or disagreeing with someone in a way that doesn't ruin that relationship. And that I think there is that level of analysis and understanding that people need. And we're like, okay, where do we get that now? And I feel like that stuff stops being taught at kindergarten or first grade. And because after that, it's like, oh, congratulations, 5-year-old. You know how to empathy. And we did it. And we know we did it because we introduced the social emotional learning curriculum. And it was great. And they're like our portions of that are embedded into the curriculums. But whenever push comes to shove, so those are the things that are pushed out first. Pushed out first is, well, if we don't have enough time to hit whatever state-funded curriculum we're supposed to be doing, social emotional learning tends to go on the back end. But then teachers then come under fire if they don't do it. But then if they do it, there's a recent situation in Florida where a teacher was presenting to children that there's pronouns, he, him, her, they, other pronouns that we should know about, and she did all the things that she was supposed to do within the policy. She let the parents know, she created a whole thing, sent out all the PowerPoints, and said, hey, also I cleared it with the superintendent. If you don't agree with this, that's okay. Here's the resources that you could use, and you yourself can decide whether or not you want to teach your child this, and your child could stay home from class that day. And it did all of the right things, and still got ostracized and still got in trouble by the community, saying that this was a dangerous thing and this was a dangerous person. Because if they're this freely opening, sharing this information, how else could it be, right? And I feel like that's a product of not continuously teaching this. Here's information, let me think about what this means first, instead of, F that, I don't want to teach that, that's not what I agree with, my way is the right way, don't talk with my children about that. Why can't we continue to teach this in society through whatever schooling that they have, or in workplaces? How many like organizational behavior management or industrial organizational things do you see where it's, whoa, if you build a happy environment where people accept you, people stay longer and they are higher producing, and it's like this huge thing that not being an ass to people is the way to go, and it's more productive. So it even hits on the production thing we were talking about before. Like, in what ways, people listening, I go challenge you, in what ways can you take those steps to start building that more inclusive culture in general in the places that you work and live, even if it's something as simple as changing the words you use, even if you don't 100% agree with it right away, or modeling for people that you can take that time to think for a minute before you respond, because that has such huge positive effects on the people around you. I don't know. It's wild. And I know, Christy, you and I talk about this all the time. I feel like this seeps into pretty much every episode we do.
Yeah.
Maybe we validate first and see what happens after that.
And it's hard, too, because I feel like it's... And I understand, because I feel like it's challenging for people to validate. And then I also get always this hierarchy. And then people are like, why should I validate your stuff if you don't validate my stuff? And then I get that, because I don't know where do we draw lines? And then so I recently had an experience where someone said, how do you feel about language? Person first, identity first, language. And I was like, okay, I believe in identity first, language. I don't call myself a person with purple hair. I call myself purple haired. Whatever. I don't call myself a person who uses her right hand. I call myself right-handed. And so why would I call myself a person with disabilities? No, I'm disabled. It's a part of my identity. I'm proud of it as a part of my identity. It has taken me a lot of work to get to this point. And I don't think that being a person with disabilities is a fair, justified way to speak about it. I feel like that person first is something that people around disabled people prefer, not disabled people. And and maybe that's not across the board. And I get that might not be across the board. However, I think that a lot of times the reason that doesn't happen across the board is still because of stigma and other people. I don't think it's because disabled people themselves really don't want to be associated with their disability. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, other than we have internalized ableism because the people around us and the society at large tells us that being disabled is not okay. So for me, I give this whole spiel, and then they say, okay, so I'm going to use person with disability and you can use disabled person. Because my experience is person with disability and yours is disabled person. Yeah. And I was like...
So I'm supposed to invalidate my feels on this to make you feel more comfortable in this situation?
And that's the thing. So you are an ally and I am the disabled person, and you just said to me, what do I prefer? And I told you this whole thing about how important it is to be accepted as a person, that my identity is rooted in my disability. And you were like, that's nice for you, but fuck that.
Yeah. Well, I feel like being an ally, honestly, Christy, maybe this is a whole episode. Being an ally should not have the sole purpose of it to be looking for that pat on the back for doing it. And I think so many times there's pieces of that where people are like, yes, I'm totally supportive of this. Yes, we're gonna have this. And then when push comes to shove, it's, look how good I'm doing. And, oh, actually, you know what? This is how we should be doing it. But not actually checking in with the people to see if what they're doing is correct. Not correcting people on identity versus person first language if it's not the right thing that person didn't say. Or, like you said, if I just told you how I want to be called and you just push back on that.
You just basically said,
that's not allyship.
Well, fuck you. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing and you can do what you want to do, but I'm not going to follow that. Yeah. I know. And then it's so weird to me because it's, do I not get to make the statement? Do I not get to say what is expertise in this area because I am the person who is living with this experience? This is my experience. I am the person. Why do I not get to say what the rules are here? Like, who gets to...
But I went to school for this. It's like, well, I feel like that's folks that have zero contact with culture. They take 8 years of Spanish or Italian or French or whatever, and then they're like, I'm an expert in this area because I can now code switch in this by speaking fluently here. And it's like, no, if you don't understand the cultural aspects of this, how can you possibly be an expert in that?
Yeah. Oh, I've done that myself, though. I feel really bad about the times that I did when I was like, oh, no.
Yeah.
This is how Islam works. And then I was like, oh, I'm in a room with I'm in a room with Muslims. Oh my God, I took 3 classes on world religion and thought that I knew what the hell I was talking about. But no, I was just being a dick. And it's not saying that we shouldn't learn stuff. Obviously we should learn, but also don't learn a little bit and then think that you are more educated about a thing than the people who live the thing, right? That is what I'm trying to say. I'm not trying to say don't learn world religion. That's fine. Do that. But then don't pretend that you know more. Yes. Like, oh, now I know everything. And you don't know what you're talking about. I have studied your religion and I know the basic tenets. You don't. Yeah. Yes, defer to the person who is living the experience. Let them be the expert, because you know what, they are.
Yeah, and well, okay, this would totally go off the topic. So here's an edit, Christy, at this point. So
I love when you say it. You're like, this, you're not going to put this in. And then I inevitably do.
It doesn't necessarily tie to the ageist conversation, but it's more about the, who gets to decide what the right thing is for people. I guess to bring it into the ageist component, what I was talking about before, you're older, therefore you should X, or you're younger, therefore you should X. If someone's young enough, and we see those things, if someone's young enough to experience these things, then they're young enough to talk about that and work through it. Now, you might not do it to the same level as an adult or use the same terms around it, but people are still experiencing those things at different ages. People are still experiencing disability, or they're experiencing ableism, ageism, racism, and so on. And the less we work towards helping people have the words to talk about those things, I think that understanding is lacking, because then we're not giving people the vocabulary to explain their life to themselves or other people. And if they don't have the vocabulary, and then people say, why didn't you advocate for yourself? It's like, I wasn't even taught the words to use this. So then we expect older people to say, why didn't you just tell us this thing? Or, oh, you're old, you're becoming senile, whatever, I'm not going to give you this. Or family members saying, I really want to connect with my family members. I want to live in my house. And if you can't live in your house anymore because you're X and X and X, and this is too much money. So then we're put in retirement homes. And then, cool, you're around other people of your age group, which has positive effects associated with that. But then you just remove that person from their comfort, from their society, and many times those retirement homes, in many cases, have not been great for people for a variety of reasons, and that's not to say that all are, but that's going against the wishes of the individual completely. And there are points where you have to, if it's 100% a safety concern, but I think that safety concern, quote unquote, becomes very fluid on whether or not people can or want to support that person who's aging throughout that time, and that becomes the decision point, not what that person is asking for being the decision point. So, I don't know.
And I think there's a lot of have to, quote unquote, that is defined by an unsupportive culture in general. You have to, because we can't afford to quit a job and stay at home with you. You have to, because we can't support your home, our daughter's home, because we're in a space where there's too much we have to spend and not enough coming in, that we have to make these really difficult decisions. But maybe in another country or in another economic system or in another maybe that's not the case, and maybe there is another option available in other places, and we're just not creating that model here for one reason or another. And what is that reason? Why isn't that happening? Why aren't we learning from other cultures in that case? Why aren't we creating supportive systems? Like, all of that then comes into play. What does have to look like, and how can we all be advocating for things that take away the have to, right? So that we do have options, that all of us have options in every age group, right? So we don't have to say to grandpa, no, you have to go to a home because I have to stay at work, because I have to spend X on childcare, because we have to have the grocery money. Those are a whole bunch of have tos that might not be in existence if we had a more supportive economic structure.
Exactly. And what are those small steps that can happen to change that economic structure as we enter in or leave late stage capitalism?
And how do I vote today in order to maybe move us toward that space, right? Because I feel like there's also this idea of, you just heard my list of have-tos, Christy. What do you think I'm going to do to, like, make this change? How am I going to shift this? But I think, what are the little things that you can do? You can vote. You can not purchase certain things. You can make small changes as you move forward.
Yeah, you can keep your thoughts to yourself until you parse those
Right.
out and figure out what that looks like. Oh
You
my
can
gosh.
give a young person with a cane your bus seat. Just get up.
Yeah.
Don't be ableist,
Well,
ageist.
and do those and not expect something in return. I think there's like a certain level of like pro-sociality associated with that, right? Making sure that not full on altruism, right? Everything that we do, there's some aspect or thing that we get out of that, but if that thing that you're getting out of it is helping other people and you are getting some positive feels yourself about that, but you're not like, oh, look, I helped this person. Oh, look. And like you're on Facebook or you're on social media saying, oh, yeah, I donated all these things today. Oh, look, this individual I helped. Or how do you assist someone without showcasing or showboating that, and how do you build that response to people?
Yeah, just understanding that being a good person makes the society better on the whole, and then making the society better makes your life better. Like we just all, it cycles up and out. Yeah, like being good creates more good. Yeah.
Yeah, universal design's just not in the spaces we build, but in the way we act and respond around people. How do you make acceptability and accessibility part of just what you do and not seen as a commodity or as something special, but just part of your everyday?
Yeah.
All right, I think we're at the end of this point because there's so many things with ageism that like moves into other topics and how age kind of associates with that, and I'm sure we're going to get into that more in other episodes. But just as some final thoughts for you, Christy, what would you want to leave the viewers with? What are some things that they should be thinking about as they listen to us talk about these things?
That's an excellent question.
What's next?
Obviously, they should eat more fiber.
Here's the 7 hot tips to reduce aging.
That is my number one tip right now. Eat more fiber. I don't know. I feel like there's a fine line, I think, between, what am I trying to say? There's a fine line between acceptance and adapting that one has to navigate. And I think at every stage, especially when you're disabled, right? There's this space where you're like, okay, do I work with this? Do I fight against this? Do I shift in ways that make this more attainable? Like, how do I work within this space? And I think that applies to everything and to everyone. And maybe the rest of us who are non-disabled don't have to look at that as often or as closely, but maybe we should. Maybe we should say, what is the line? Where do I have to adapt? And what do I have to accept? And what do I push back against? What do I let go of? And where do I have to make some changes so that the world is more open and accessible? And I think if non-disabled people were making those choices as often as disabled people were, like maybe we would have a much different structure and a lot more thought going into the things that we're doing, right? That was maybe a little more philosophical than you expected, especially after my weird fiber comment. But
from fiber to philosophy. What you pay
but
for.
Please pay more, even though that is super awkward. I do think that is the case, right? I don't think when we're not forced to be reflective about these issues, maybe we just aren't. So I think I would appreciate that from everyone to be like, oh yeah, what am I how am I looking at age and ability, and how can I maybe reconsider and shift in some of those spaces without having to be forced, right? Without being like, oh, here's my gay cousin or my whomever who's in my face showing me that I need to change what I'm thinking, without having to smack into these issues. Where can I look for people, not to educate me and whatever, like it's not their job, but where can I look for people to hear their lived experience? I mean, there's stuff on YouTube, there's blogs out there, there's lots of people that would come and do some advocacy and speak to you. Yes, but you don't need to don't accost people on the street and ask them about their disabilities, please. Like, actually go online, find some people that do public speaking and self-advocacy, and hear those stories and figure out where you can make some of those changes ahead of time before you're forced into these discussions. What about you, Rocco? What
kind of proactive?
Sorry. What are some of you?
Oh, no,
what are some of your thoughts around steps people can take, and last thoughts?
Well, I think you said a portion of one of the things I wanted to cover on that, of doing the work that you can or finding the information first without expecting people to either relive that trauma or tell you what the answer is. I think when people say they didn't tell me, or why can't they just quote unquote tell me what they need or what they want, maybe you didn't create an environment that was safe enough for them to do. And I know we've all failed at doing that for people in the past and work towards it. But that kind of goes into it's not enough to say and showcase that you are doing the work. You actually have to do the work. Just the thought processes behind it, and that maybe you've done the first step of, oh yeah, this is a thing that I should be thinking about. That's great. Find your community to be able to do that, but if you're going to showcase it, instead of showcasing it to other people, try to bring other people in on what you're doing and say, oh look, I did this thing. I would love to talk with people about this. Right? Here's this piece that really assisted in a way that people thought was useful. Would anybody else be interested in joining me next time? And having that extra little action item. And on that note, let's ask the listeners, what is your input and experiences on ageism in general? What things have you felt like you've contacted? What things have you done to try to limit ageism? What examples and non-examples have you seen that were people engaging in ageism? Maybe it was yourself. So we'll put something down in the show notes for this, but we really want to hear from people. What has been your experience in this? And we really want to create that community around making these changes. That's the whole reason why we're doing this podcast, to bypass a lot of the paywalls to gain access to this information that people would normally get at conferences or in articles and journals that are expensive. So let's continue building that community in a way that's accessible to people everywhere as much as we can.
Beautiful.
Boom. In the immortal words of Jack Black.
Are they immortal? Will they keep lasting forever? Like the Highlander?
That could be only one. All right, I think we did it.
Fabulous.
Good.
Are you passionate about accessibility and inclusion, but don't know who to connect with? We welcome you to join the Global Accessibility and Inclusion Network, founded by the creators of the Disability Tangent podcast.
Our mission is simple: to connect communities to available resources and create a supportive network of individuals from all backgrounds. Join us as we unite disability advocates from around the world to share knowledge, collaborate on initiatives, and drive positive change.
Whether you're an experienced activist or just starting your journey, there's a place for you in our network. To learn more and become part of this powerful movement, check out the show notes for this episode and sign up today.
We're not losing
We're
it.
not losing it. We might be losing it, but we're not losing it on this particular point.
Feels
It
like
is
it.
fine. Yes, I know. I mean, the spoons are great, but the HRV. Yes, HRV.
Yeah.
Sorry,
I'm with
then
you.
I'm like, then I'm like, wait, what does it? Then I'm always like, wait, what does it stand for again? Heart rate variability. That's what it is. Heart rate variability.
I was gonna say, for those of you who can't see the video, there was a moment where I think we physically glitched, and we were just staring at each other.
Heart rate variability is a better measure of energy to come, so that you don't have to use your spoons and then realize you used your spoons. Yes.
Yeah.
Heart rate variability is a what's the word for, like, you know it in advance? A prescription for energy.
Premonition?
Premonition. Let's not get started on those. That might be it. That's a whole other conversation.
That's a whole nother episode.
That's
Yeah,
a very witchy episode.
exactly.
Which is fine.
And on the next episode of Disability Witch Tangent.
Witch tangent. I like witch tangents.